Death at Gallows Green. Chapter 46. The terrorist and the policeman both come from the same basket. Joseph Conrad, the secret agent. P.C. Bradley proved to be more injured in pride than in person by Edward's attack. He had gone back to Manningtree to write his report and, without a doubt, to accuse his fellow officer of violent assault. Edward sat still in Agnes's kitchen, nursing a jammed thumb and a cup of hot tea. "I've made it worse," he said miserably. "Only for yourself," Agnes said. She went to the fire and stirred it. "What will they do to you?" Edward managed a half-smile. "Force me to endure Bell's berating," he said. "It would be worse than that, of course. Edward could be charged not only with assaulting a policeman, but with the obstruction of justice. It would mean the end of his police career." She sat down at the table across from him. "Someone actually did murder the man, then?" "Yes," Edward said. "Someone wearing narrow, sharp-pointed heels." "It's no wonder that the constable wanted to see my boots," Agnes said. "This dead man, Mr. Todd," she studied her laced fingers. "Is it thought that he killed Artie?" "Yes," Edward said, devouring her with his eyes. Her face was lined and pale, her eyes sunk deep in their sockets as if she were starved for sleep. But her skin had the translucence of fine porcelain, and her brown hair was like silk. He ached to touch it. She did not look up, and it's thought that he may have had something to do with Betsy's death. Wordlessly, Edward nodded. The words were drawn out thinly like wire. "Does the constable really believe that I could have killed him?" Edward never knew what he might have answered. Indeed, he was spared from answering at all, for at that moment the latch rattled loudly and the door burst open. Betsy, shirtless and shoeless, and with bits of straw stuck in her head, flung herself with a cry across the room and into the open arms of her mother. Edward stood dumbfounded and knocked his chair over with a crash. Then he shouted, "Betsy!" and clasped both mother and daughter to his breast in an incredulous embrace, while a beaming Qa'Rajh, holding an improbable white duck under one arm, looked on. The next few minutes were a chaos of incredulous tears and wondering laughter, but after a little calm was restored, and Betsy was wrapped in her mother's shawl and seated at her mother's knee. Kep sat on one side of her, released at last from the tie roped behind the shed, which the curl of the Smith boy had fastened around his neck, and which had kept him from tracking Betsy to Todd's shed. A cup of hot milk in one hand and a large piece of bread and butter on the other, she began to tell her story, helped in the task with questions from her mother, Kate, and Edward. "But he did feed you," Agnes said worriedly. "You did have something to eat." "For a while," Betty said with a mouthful, "until he went away the night before last. After that I didn't have anything at all." She cast a guilty glance in the direction of the dog to whom Miss Artley was serving a bowl of milk and bits and bread, and lowered her voice. "I was thinking of eating one of Jemima's eggs." Edward leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You didn't happen to see Mr. Todd go away, then?" "Well, yes, I actually did." Betsy swallowed what she had in her mouth. "I was hoping he would think to bring me a biscuit before he left, but he was too busy arguing." "Arguing?" Kate asked. "With whom?" Edward demanded eagerly. "I don't know," Betsy said. She yawned and tugged at her braid. "The man, they were rather angry." "Do you remember anything about the man?" Edward asked, trying not to show how intent he was upon her answer. Betsy yawned again. "He had black whiskers and—" "Black whiskers!" Kate exclaimed. She turned to Edward. "It is Tom Brock. If you hurry, you can find him still asleep in his shack behind the Pig and Whistle." Agnes turned to Edward, her eyes large in a white face. "You believe, then, that Betsy saw the man who killed Mr. Todd?" Betsy sat quite still. "Mr. Todd is dead?" "Yes," Kate said simply. Agnes knelt down beside Betsy and pulled her daughter into her arms. She looked at Edward over the child's head, and Edward could read the pleading in her eyes. "Enough of death," she was saying. "She has had too much already." But Edward could not allow himself to be moved. "We need to know what you saw, Betsy," he said as gently as he could. Betsy rested her forehead against her mother's shoulder. "He wasn't a nice man," she said in a muffled voice, "but he brought me food, and I don't think he really intended to hurt me. Whatever he did to make the other man angry, he didn't deserve to get killed." She sighed and straightened up. "No one does." Edward stood up and looked down at Betsy. "Do you think you would know the other man if you saw him again?" "Yes," Betsy said drowsily. She rubbed her eyes with her hands. "He had a queer stiff walk." Her yawn was huge and her head began to droop. "A stiff walk?" Edward put out his hand and shook Betsy's shoulder gently to wake her up. How did he walk, Betsy? Betsy sagged against her mother's breast, her eyes closed. His legs, she said in a blurry voice. What she said next stunned Edward into speechlessness. He stared at her, disbelieving. You're sure? He asked. You're quite sure? Her only answer was but a simple, sleepy nod. Kate looked at him. What does it mean? She asked. When he told her, her eyes widened. Agnes gave an incredulous gasp. You don't suppose she was dreaming, do you? She asked. Or that she saw something and invented the rest? She's given to making up stories, you know. No, Edward said softly. Betsy did not invent the man. He's quite real. Quite real indeed.